From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones.
So it all took place on Parliament Square, and at one end you've got that line of statues, and Palestine Action like to point to Mahatma Gandhi there, the godfather of peaceful protest, let's say. And then in front of that you had sort of rows and rows and rows of people seated. You know, they'd been told before in the briefings that they'd attended not to say anything, to bring a sign saying, "I oppose genocide, I support Palestine Action." The police had gathered up right up near Parliament in lines, and then as soon as the protest started, they just came in and started arresting people.
How you doing? You all right? Yeah. The minute you're under arrest, okay, for Section 13 of the Terrorism Act, okay, 2000, for holding signs for a prescribed group. Now, safety being made harm intervention. Do not mention my question. Something to later on. Thank you.
522 people were arrested at that protest in central London, the largest number arrested in one operation in the past decade, the Met Police said.
But of course, to arrest some people takes large numbers of people. I mean, the photos afterwards showed people being carried by 5 or 6 officers. One particularly striking arrest was a disabled man arrested in his wheelchair. Quite extraordinary.
Palestine Action will soon be in court fighting their prescription as a terrorist organisation, and some of the people who say they support them are being processed through the system too. We're going to look at who they are and how we got here. The story today. Who is Palestine Action? The protest group dubbed terrorists.
I'm Tom Witherow. I'm a news reporter for The Times.
What did we see at the weekend with these protests? Quite a few people were arrested, 522. What are they arrested on suspicion of?
So at the start of July, Palestine Action was proscribed as a terror group. And that means that if you go out and show support for them in public, then you are opening yourself up to arrest. And those 500 people were arrested under Section 13 of the Terror Act 2000, which means that if you go out in public with an item of clothing or a sign where an officer can reasonably believe that you support that group, then you can be arrested.
So it's not being a member, it's not doing something on their behalf, it is just, I'm holding a sign saying I support insert name of prescribed terror group.
Yeah.
Gosh. So what are some of these people facing? To be arrested on suspicion of this means what for them?
So they've been arrested. Most of the ones from Saturday have been bailed. But we've seen from protests that took place shortly after the prescription at the start of July that police have started charging people under that same section. Now, the maximum sentence, if it does go to trial and they're found guilty, would be up to 6 months in jail. So really serious offences, as you can imagine from something passed under terror legislation. The aim of these activists is to try and demonstrate that the law is in some way absurd. That's kind of the point of these actions. I mean, the organisers believe that they will not be convicted at the end of all this. That remains to be seen. We may talk about it later, but Palestine Action has an ongoing legal challenge to their prescription by the Home Secretary. But if you are found guilty of a terror offence, that's very serious. It hardly needs to be said.
Yeah.
And I imagine that the people who are out there sitting in Parliament Square will have thought long and hard as to whether they want that on their record, because it could have an effect on your ability to travel internationally. I imagine that you would be very unlikely to get an entry into the USA with a terror conviction. And who knows, it could affect your immigration status if there are people living in the UK with different types of statuses, and surely your ability to get a job as well.
What do we know about some of the 522 people who were arrested? Quite a varied bunch. I think there's even a Knight of the Realm in there, isn't there?
Well, I thought one of the most striking numbers was that supposedly half of them were over 60. But perhaps that comes back to the point we've just made. If you're struggling to get a job by going out and protesting, then you're more likely to go if you're retired. I mean, there are all sorts. When there was a press conference before the protest took place, and one of the people speaking there was a consultant gynecologist. There was I think what we call a professional protester. She said she'd been arrested 100 times previously.
Gosh.
In one of the previous protesters, there was an 83-year-old ordained priest, a teacher I've seen. Undoubtedly, one of the kind of themes of the people who are out there, and this will come back to the history of Palestine Action, is the environmental protests and Extinction Rebellion and Insulate Britain. A lot of the people who were protesting then are also back now with Palestine Action.
I see. And just finally on how these protests were policed at the weekend and how they have been in the past, such an enormous number of people to actually arrest. Were the police even able to do that? That seems quite a task.
Yeah, so the police had to switch up their tactics for this particular protest. As I said, this is probably the fourth or fifth of a similar type that we've had in the last few weeks. But the ones before, I think it started at about 25 people and then 50 and then 100, and now we're up well over 500. And the police were not really able to cope. There were people who were at the protest and left after the official end of the protest, which was an hour or two, unarrested. So they come and, according to the police, have done an arrestable offence, but were able to walk off. Others were arrested and bailed on the spot because there weren't enough police cells to accommodate all 800 protesters. And police had complained that they weren't able to stop those people who'd just been arrested returning and sitting straight back down with the protest. So kind of farcical in one sense. And critics of this prescription have said, well, it should have been foreseeable that you're going to create a situation where the police wouldn't be able to cope. I think someone said to me the police have about 500 cells at their disposal in London at any one time. So it gives you an idea of what this type of mass civil disobedience can bring.
Just do the maths. We can't seem to move for mention of Palestine Action at the moment with their prescription and obviously these protests that we've seen, but they're not necessarily an invention of the last few months or even year or so. Where did the group come from?
So Palestine Action existed even before the latest phase of the Israeli-Palestine conflict that started with that terrible massacre on October the 7th. It was founded in 2020, and it was founded by a lady called Huda Amori. She's in her early 30s. She was born in Bolton to a Palestinian father and an Iraqi mother. And I suppose her entry into this world of activism came through the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is relative to Palestine Action, a moderate, protest-driven group arguing for Palestinian statehood and so on. But over time, she felt that that whole movement, which of course has continued for many years, if not decades, had not had the impact and was not actually having any effect on the ground in the Middle East.
We have tried appealing to the powers that be.
Okay.
It does not work, and so we are taking matters into our own hands. It's incomparable to amount a broken window or a broken weapon to the life that can be taken and are taken by these weapons.
It's probably worth mentioning that Amori's great-grandfather was involved in the 1936 uprising in Palestine against the British and was killed by British soldiers. And she said they also destroyed her ancestral home. So, well beyond just her Palestinian roots, but also her, her family and her heritage.
So she saw a gap for a group like this that she wanted to see. How did she or others go about actually setting it up?
So I guess one of the key figures in terms of their tactics is that she joined forces with an experienced Extinction Rebellion activist called Richard Barnard. Entirely different background, raised a Catholic, once belonged to a Christian anarchist group called the Catholic Worker, and today identifies as Muslim. He said that he picked up the idea of throwing red paint on buildings from his Christian activism. Of course, it was also a tactic that was used by Insulate Britain and some of the other environmental groups. And the type of tactics that they use range from those environmental ones, going and sitting in front of a building and spraying it with paint. We see it at sort of Barclays Bank and Allianz insurers. And they choose those targets based on, what they believe to be links to the Israeli state and its military machine, all the way up to, some of the things we've seen in the news, which are the real criminal damage smashing windows, breaking computers, taking all sorts of steps to try and shut down whatever business they're targeting.
Because their ask is what?
The original aim of Palestine Action was to target a subsidiary of Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli weapons maker, supplies all sorts of items to the Israeli military. The UK hosts several sites of Elbit Systems UK, which is, as I said, a subsidiary, making parts for drones and all sorts of things. And that subsidiary supplies the UK military.
Palestine Action is very clear that our primary aim is to stop these Israeli weapons factories from operating. And as soon as they stop operating, then there will be no more need for Palestine Action. But until they are gone from this country, we will continue to take direct action against them. We will continue to take action against those who supply them, against those who lease their properties to them, invest in them, because they are fueling the genocide of the Palestinian people.
I see. And I can imagine, even though this group existed before October the 7th happens in 2023, and that really puts a wind up their cause as they see it. Is that when they really started to break through into the public consciousness?
Yeah, so they pretty much focused on targeting this one subsidiary of the Israeli weapons company up until October the 7th. But the boom, effectively, in their membership, people signing up to take part in actions after October the 7th, meant that they could expand what targets they chose. They went for much more direct action and in some cases more kind of extreme. They were able to kind of hype up their recruitment methods and then also hone tactics for the sort of new age of much greater scrutiny on what they're doing and much greater interest from the police. So find ways to make their work more secretive. They were getting people to use encrypted messaging apps. They designed a manual for people to use. They encouraged actionists to go into cells to try and make their communications more secure. So they were able to become a much more sophisticated group and make it more difficult for actions to be stopped before they happened.
And what kind of thing did they end up doing? I mean, obviously we have the famous example of them damaging that plane at RAF Bryce Norton.
Yeah, I mean, the total number of actions between the start of the war and today is something like 400 or more. They are occupying military sites. They are taking sledgehammers to computers. They're standing on the roof with flares. In one case, they chucked a smoke bomb into a factory that still had some of its employees in there. They vary. Some of them are just 2 or 3 people, some of them many more. So a key question now is, as we discuss the prescription and whether it's going to hold, is just how violent is this group? And whatever the answer to that is, there's no doubt that for people on these sites that many of these actions would be quite terrifying.
Take us back to the beginning of this debate on the prescription point. When did this start to become a thing which we thought the government might be considering?
So the massive turning point was this action that took place at RAF Bryce Norton, where a small number of activists broke through the fence and riding electric scooters, scooted down the runway and attacked 2 refueling jets, so RAF planes. And they sprayed the red paint into the engines, and the damage was later totted up at around £7 million. This very quickly flicked the switch with the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, and she announced to Parliament quite shortly afterwards that she was going to seek prescription. That was put down into the House of Commons and it was voted through pretty comfortably. I think only about 26 MPs voting against.
And what was her reasoning in her proposal? What was her pitch as to why they should be prescribed?
So the Terrorism Act 2000, which was brought in to try and bring together a few different threads of former counter-terror work, was drawn pretty broadly. And it means that you can prescribe a group not just if it's violence against people, but also if it causes serious criminal damage. And so the large part of the arguments against Palestine Action has been that it's causing huge amounts of criminal damage. And the argument against, for those who make it, is that there are already laws that cover this. And we have already seen Palestine Action people go through the courts and there they are tried for trespass, criminal damage, crimes like that.
Which is something we've seen with some of those groups that you mentioned earlier, Just Stop Oil, when people are throwing soup over priceless paintings or gluing themselves to gallery floors. There are laws to stop them from doing that and doing that damage, or at least punish them after the fact.
Yeah, and I think that the reason why it's controversial is that there are plenty of other groups that, whether purposefully or whether by chance, cause criminal damage in their actions. This might be anti-racist campaigners. This might be trade unionists fighting against an employer. It could be hunt saboteurs who are out trespassing on land to try and prevent what they see as illegal hunting. So campaigners against the proscription of Palestine Action are arguing that the government has overreached here, and by banning a direct action group, they compare the work of Palestine Action to the suffragettes who famously bombed and killed the grass on golf courses and disrupted the King's Horse at Ascot. This is a different time to the early 20th century, but there is an element of hypocrisy when you see members of Starmer's cabinet celebrating the suffragettes and what they achieved in their time, and then immediately banning Palestine Action at the other end.
But also in that you have groups like, armies like Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they're not a prescribed terrorist organisation, I only learned recently.
That's right, yes. So, that is a group that has already shown its willingness to harm people in Britain, and that has not been prescribed yet.
So how did Palestine Action receive this news that they were going to be prescribed? What was their response?
So Huda Amori, the founder, immediately launched a legal action against it. This kind of comes in two different guises. The first one was an attempt to get an interim injunction to stop the prescription until the main case could be heard. And then that main case, which is a judicial review of the government's decision. So the first part of that failed, and the judge said that there was no good reason for the prescription to be delayed until that judicial review. But on the judicial review, she's had an initial victory, which is that a judge has ruled that there is an arguable case. And that case is effectively to say, okay, so it looks like the prescription fits under British law, that's the Terrorism Act, and that's partly because of what it says about serious damage to property. But British laws must be balanced against human rights law, which since the time of Tony Blair was imputed into British law. So it is a human right to freedom of expression, Article 10, and then also freedom of association, so the ability to join up in groups and freely associate. So when it comes to that judicial review, they will perform some sort of balancing exercise, well beyond my mind in terms of the legals, to decide which one comes out on top, the human rights of people to go out and protest and freely associate, or the common law under the Terror Act.
And when will we hear that?
That's going to be in the autumn.
And in the interim, while we all continue to argue over this, the government has of late been, sort of revealing a bit more about why they prescribed them as the argument rages. What have we learned recently?
So the escalating protests have put the government under some pressure to justify its decision, and they've had some backlash from celebrities. Bianca Jagger was out protesting, and also human rights groups, international and otherwise. Amnesty is one of them, that this is executive overreach, effectively. And Yvette Cooper and Keir Starmer have been making some of those arguments in the last 10 days or so. The main ones that they point to is they're saying that they have intelligence to suggest that what we can see as the public is not all there is, without revealing any more. They say that this is a violent group, and they cite a small number of attacks on people or alleged attacks on people. Some of these things are still going through the courts.
There may be people who are objecting to prescription who don't know the full nature of this organisation because of court restrictions on reporting while serious prosecutions are underway. But it's really important that no one's in any doubt that this is not a non-violent organisation.
And then they also cite attacks on Jewish-owned businesses.
Jewish-owned businesses that have got nothing to do with Israel or these arms firms.
So there are three main things that I think are being referred to by the Prime Minister. The best known of these attacks was on a Jewish-owned investment group in Stamford Hill. This kind of highlights that Palestine Action, the way that it operates in those cells means that it can be quite haphazard.
And I guess diffuse in their decision-making as well. It's not like there is someone in charge calling the shots.
Absolutely. And I think Palestine Action probably lists some suggested targets at these trainings. But if somebody decides to take it upon themselves to do something locally, then that might not necessarily come from the centre. But in this case, the action was meant to be against a business that's registered as the landlord of Instro Precision Weapons, which is a subsidiary of Elbit Systems. And after the action, the company said that it actually had no connection with Elbit at all, and pointed out quite understandably that the incident had terrified its employees. And the quote from that owner was, "For Jewish people, it is very, very scary now." And it obviously comes in the context of, a genuine rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic attacks. The fact that they have no links to this weapons factory, perhaps it makes no difference. It's a terrifying thing either way. And this comes up against a couple of other actions against Jewish groups. The CST, which is a kind of charity that protects Jewish people at events, said that in May, Palestine Action sprayed red paint on the outside of Jewish-owned offices in Prestwick. And in November, the group said to vandalise offices of the Jewish National Fund, that's a Zionist charity, and the pro-Israel lobbying group BICOM. So it's not the only one to take place. I think the argument of Palestine Action is we don't discriminate on whether it's a Jewish-owned business. We are interested in groups that they say, are contributing to Israel's military efforts in Gaza.
And if then part of the government's argument relies on intelligence, we could be in a situation, could we not, post the autumn, say this decision is upheld in the courts, but we don't necessarily know the reason because the evidence presented to the court is something that we can't see and you can't freely report on. That still could be quite an unsustainable situation where we have this group which many people equate in their minds with just being concerned about the Palestinian cause, but the government is saying, no, it is a proscribed terrorist organisation, leave them alone.
All I'd say about that is that it does seem like there's a slight disconnect between the rhetoric of Yvette Cooper and what was said in court. I was in court on the 4th of July when the initial attempt to get an interim injunction was put in front of a judge. And the Home Office barrister, in my mind, was very much pointing to this is what the text of the Terror Act says. They are an organisation engaging in mass criminal damage. They should be proscribed, and that is the arguable case. Maybe they felt that they weren't under an enormous amount of pressure and they could stick with this basic argument. But we would hope that through the judicial review process, if there were to be intelligence, even if the public weren't told about it for some legitimate reason, that we would at least be told that that was what they were basing their argument on, because the judge will have to make their own decision.
In the meantime, what do you think is going to happen? Are we just going to see more of these protests, more police out struggling to arrest people in these enormous numbers, and as you said, arresting people, bailing on the spot, some of them joining the protest again? I mean, is that just going to go on and on until November or whatever?
Yeah, Defend Our Jury is the group that's organising these protests against the deprescription. Basically say that they will keep going until the case is heard in what's likely to be November. So that's another 2 or 3 months. Will more people join? Well, I would have thought on the strength of this weekend, that's quite likely because they are undoubtedly overwhelming the police's ability to counter it and to uphold the law that's been passed. The only limit on these protests is people's willingness to be charged with a terror offence, which amazingly 800 people were willing to have a go.
And if part of the thing they're trying to do is show how ridiculous the legal situation is around it, as they would see it, this circus of arresting people, bailing on the spot, all that kind of business, does that, especially in the sort of media narrative, help the argument that some of these people are making? Look, it's ridiculous, they'd say.
Well, I think one thing that is an unknown in all of this is what the public thinks about Palestine Action. I haven't seen any polling on what the general public thinks about it. There is plenty of polling on how people feel about the war in Israel. Some of it's quite interesting. Support for Israel has remained pretty consistent since October the 7th at about 15% of the population, and support for Palestine was below that after October the 7th, but then has risen up to be considerably higher and now is over a third of the country. So in terms of the wider sentiment towards the war, there's been a very clear direction there. But Palestine Action are not, the Palestinian people. They are people committing mass criminal acts. I don't think most people in Britain believe that the right way to get your point across is by the sledgehammer and the flare, let's say. And those individuals who are out there now with their signs are still going directly against a law. And I don't think people would have much sympathy if they turn around and were upset later when they find that they can't get a job, for example, because I don't think it takes much to realise that a terror charge is very, very serious.
And of course, a lot of demonstrations or, this civil disobedience event, a lot of it is about projecting an image to the public. And on the face of it, this was doing what, do you think?
Well, I think as the weeks have gone on and we've seen these protests ratchet up, there's no doubt that the people who might be thinking about taking part have been encouraged. In the first week, there were 25 arrests. That included the 83-year-old priest I mentioned earlier. And I think people felt that there was a real opportunity here. Terror laws have always been controversial in this country, and the wide scope that I mentioned before is something that lots of people on the left, lots of people with human rights backgrounds have sought opportunities to try and show, and that this really is no better opportunity than this one. That growth from 25 4 weeks ago to 500 this weekend really shows more than anything that clearly these protests are garnering support, they're garnering pace, and who knows where they're going to go in future weeks.
Tom Witherow, news reporter at The Times. There is plenty more from Tom and his colleagues on Palestine Action and these protests over at thetimes.com, which you can read if you've got a subscription. That is it from us today. The producer was Rosie Stopher, the executive producer was Edward Drummond, and sound design and theme composition was by Mauro Seto. I'm Luke Jones. See you soon.